Welcome to Who's the Greatest? It's the programme that starts as many arguments as it solves, as we compare the sporting heroes of a great and glorious past with those who are making the biggest headlines today. Tonight, it's football. Who's the greatest? Jimmy Greaves, a goal-scoring genius throughout the 1960s, or Ian Rush, Liverpool's ace marksman, soon to start a new career in Italy? Again, we have two celebrity advocates, and stating the case for Jimmy Greaves, please welcome Ted Rogers. Ted, the popular 3-2-1 host, of course, but more important still tonight, a lifelong fan of Jimmy Greaves. Stating the case for Ian Rush, here's Stan Boardman. Well, Stan, a comedian, as we all know, but also a red-blooded Liverpool fan and a regular at Anfield. And both Ted and Stan are king jokers, but they are deadly serious about their football. And to lend weight and authority to their cases, they'll be able to call expert witnesses. And after that, of course, we then turn to our sports jury, 12 independent-minded members of our studio audience, and they'll decide in the next half hour who's the greatest. Will our jury select Jimmy Greaves, who scored a record 357 First Division goals in 516 Football League matches? He made his debut for Chelsea at 17 and made the headlines even then by scoring against Spurs, the club for whom he later netted 272 league and cup goals. He scored 44 goals in 57 England matches. That's an international scoring rate over a career that nobody has come close to. He won 2 FA Cup winners' medals and helped Spurs to the Cup Winners' Cup in 1963, taking his career tally to 491 goals. Or will the jury vote for Ian Rush, who made his name with 3rd Division Chester, where his 14 league goals in 34 appearances persuaded Liverpool to pay £300,000 for him in 1980. He scored more than 200 goals, helping Liverpool to victory at Wembley last year and the Cup and League double, to 3 other championships and to 2 European Cup finals. Rush, voted Footballer of the Year in 1984, scored a dozen goals in his first 29 internationals, over half the entire Welsh total in these games. And it was this consistency for Wales and Liverpool that encouraged Juventus to pay a record £3.2 million for him to move to Italy next season. Well, it certainly is a fascinating case to get you arguing, but who's the greatest? Well, I'm here as the judge to see that both sides get a fair hearing. And remember, we are here to praise and not to prosecute. So, Ted, please state your case now for Jimmy Greaves.
I've got to tell you that it really is a pleasure for me to be here representing a footballer that I've idolised since he first appeared as a precocious, crop-haired 17-year-old with Chelsea. And let me straight away make the point that when Jimmy kicked off his career, it was under the handicap that Ian Rush and many of the modern stars have never experienced. Because in those days, the ball was really heavy. So much so that if you headed it, you ended up with a neck like Mike Tyson. Boots, they really were big. Those boots in those days, they made Doc Martens look like hush puppies. Jimmy overcame all of this by making scoring really look easy. I can clearly remember now on his debut, scoring against Spurs at White Hart Lane in the summer of 1957. This was the first of an all-time record 357 First Division goals. It was also the start of a remarkable sequence because Jimmy scored in every major debut he made throughout his career. There's a generation growing up now that look at Greavesy with great affection for his entertaining performances as a television personality, and of course I do the same. I adore him on television, but anybody from my generation, well, he'll always be thought of first and foremost as the greatest British goal scorer that ever lived. Jimmy was simply a genius, and to be honest, to try and compare him to Ian Rush, well, that's like trying to compare Rolf Harris and Michelangelo. I mean, Jim used to play his football exactly the way he does his job on the telly, with lots of cheek, lots of wit and invention. I used to think of Jimmy as the artful dodger of football, the arch pickpocket in the penalty area. Yeah, some say that Jimmy didn't play flat out for 90 minutes. Well, they say he wasn't a workhorse. Well, they're right, of course. Jimmy was a thoroughbred. He proved even more elusive than Shergar. People often say that it was easier to score goals then because the game was not so defensive. But they seem to forget that Jimmy used to have to operate against markers. And I'm talking about markers like Norman Bite-Your-Legs Hunter. He left you covered with more bite marks than Christopher Lee. Then there was the toothless tiger from Manchester United, Nobby Stiles. He could give you a very nasty suck with his gums. The terrifying Tommy Smith. He never took any prisoners, him. Yes. He was had up for indecent exposure. He showed his face. And then... Then, of course, there was the old Chelsea assassin, Ron Chopper Harris. Funny nickname, Harris, wasn't it? These goals were just a handful of the 44 he scored in 57 full internationals. You know, only Bobby Charlton scored more for England, and his 46 goals took 106 matches to compile.
The crown of greatness brought off number 8, Jimmy Greaves.
And here to help prove that Greavesy was and is the greatest, I have two past masters of football who played with and against Jim. My first expert witness is the man who was Jimmy's England teammate, himself no mean marksman, and playing for Fulham and West Bromwich Albion, the present manager of the England team, Bobby Robson. Lovely seeing you. Now, what would you say was so special about Jimmy Greaves?
Well, he was sheer brilliance. He was an out-and-out genius. I think his genius was that wherever the ball was in relationship to the goal, he always knew the perfect shot to hit. And he was really quite a remarkable marksman. And if you gave him the half a yard that he needed, which was all he needed sometimes, he would leave you for dead. There was no way that you would ever catch him. And on the 1v1 situation with a goalkeeper, which sometimes is difficult, it's not as easy as it looks sometimes, Jimmy never missed. I mean, Jimmy was the master in that respect as well.
Now, listen, if he were, Bobby, in his prime today, would his name be on the England team sheet?
Certainly, yes. One, yes, well, because I'll tell you why. If you're going to create and make chances, Jimmy will take them. Jimmy will put you in a winning position because he will score goals. He had this remarkable knack for knowing how to score goals. With his back to the goal, on an angle, right in front of the goal. And therefore, you couldn't leave a player of that talent out of the team.
What do you think, again, if he were in his prime today, Jimmy, what would his value be on the transfer market?
He'd be the highest. I mean, if you're talking 3 million or 3.5 million for Rush or Lineker, then Jimmy Greaves, in my opinion, would be more than that because he's the best and greatest goal scorer we have ever seen.
See, Jim, tell that to TVAM. You get a few more bob. Ladies and gentlemen, Bobby Robson. Thank you very much, Bobby. Well, now, just in case there is somebody that still is in any doubt that Jimmy Greaves, of course, was the greatest, I'm sure that you will now be swayed by somebody who would have had the support as many as being one of the greatest footballers, scorers of them all. Former Manchester United, Manchester City, and idol of Scotland, Denis Law. Lovely to see you. Now, why are you here tonight patronising this cheeky Sassenach?
He was, to me, the greatest striker I've ever seen. He was so deadly inside the box. I don't think I've seen a striker so cool in that area of the penalty box like Jimmy Greaves. He was, I mean, you see many goals that are scored, but Greavesy, you know, by bashing them. And we've seen a clip of Greavesy when he hit one in, but really, all his goals, most of his goals were always placed, you know, which is a sign of a very, very good striker and the greatest.
And what about then, Dennis, the critics who labelled Jimmy as lazy?
Well, I suppose from the opposition's point of view, that might be true, because if he was a very busy player, of course, he'd have scored over 600 goals. So from their point of view, that was good that he was lazy. No, Jimmy, he reserved his energy, you know, he conserved it there. He didn't sort of dash about. He waited until around that penalty area, and that's where all, say, 90% of his energy was done, and of course that's why he scored so many goals.
And of course you were an unbelievable goal scorer yourself, and yet you acknowledge Jimmy was the king.
Well, of course, again, I mean, I've played against and I've played with some of the best players in the world, and every time that Greavesy had the ball, I really don't care where it was, it always felt that a little was going to score, particularly when United played Spurs. We didn't win many times at Spurs, but we were leading 2-1. It was only 2 or 3 minutes to go, And little Greaves, who had not been in the game at all, came up, equalised. So I thought, well, at least we're going back with a point. A minute later, Greavesy again, a little bang, 3-2.
Yeah, and that was it.
3-2 and got beat and went back with nothing. After playing so well. He never kicked the ball for 89 minutes.
Well, there you are.
He didn't.
That was him. No doubts then in your mind that Jimmy Greaves was the greatest?
He was the greatest and will always be the greatest.
Ladies and gentlemen, Denis Law. Thank you, Denis. Thank you. There you go. Well, my two distinguished witnesses have said all that really needs to be said to prove that I'm not exaggerating when I call Jimmy Greaves the greatest goal scorer of them all. He played his football with a swagger. Never arrogant, he always competed in the very sporting spirit. Jimmy could produce moments of sheer genius, and the memories of these, they're going to warm you for months afterwards when you saw him do what he did. He put a smile on the face of football. The remarkable thing about Jimmy's 491 goals is that every one of them did come at the highest level. He never got his goals on the cheap in the lower divisions. I feel privileged to have seen him play. He really is simply the greatest. But I was going to say my defence rests, members of the jury, but with a Jimmy about, nobody dare take it easy. That, members of the jury, is the case for Jimmy Greaves, the greatest goal scorer of them all. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ted. I have to say that's an exceptional case that you've put on behalf of Jimmy Greaves, along with your expert witnesses, Bobby Robson and Denis Law. You certainly made it pretty tough for our sports jury as they now wait for Stan Boardman to come out shooting for Ian Rush. Rejoin us then after the break, and together we shall find out who's the greatest.
New Oriental from Lynx, the body spray for men that's hard to top. Lynx, because first impressions last. If you find some mustards a little overpowering, you'll appreciate the subtle flavor of Amora, France's favorite, because it's made with red wine, and white wine with whole grains. But while you're enjoying Amora, spare a thought for those still going for the hot stuff. Amora mustard. It makes Amora the flavor of food.
One company above all stands for British excellence. Soon, you will be able to buy shares in that company. Rolls-Royce. Phone 01 200 3000 for a brochure and prospectus.
I spy with my little eye something beginning with S.
See?
No S.
Oh, I'm not playing.
Well, it's nice to get out.
Yes, it would be.
What?
Who wants some oxo?
Yeah, some.
Slowly.
Just kept putting on weight.
Slimming magazine. What a relief to find something you can get into.
Welcome back to Who's the Greatest? Well, Ted Rogers has made out his case for Jimmy Greaves, but now it's the turn of Stan Boardman to argue the merits of Ian Rush. And then, as you know, our sports jury will deliver their verdict as to who's the greatest. Stan, the ball's at your feet.
Thank you. Thank you, Brian. Well, there was no bigger fan of Jimmy Greaves than me. The only thing wrong with him was he never wore a Liverpool shirt. Hey, this is serious, shut up. It's a funny old game. I never dreamt I would see the day when a greater goal scorer came along, but he's here. I refer, of course, to Ian Rush. I'll tell you why Rush is even greater than Greavesy, and it's not because his dad's chip shop was bombed by the Germans. Well, it's because he was involved in the game for 90 minutes. And what was all that rubbish my learned friend, Ted Rogers...
I object. It was the wrong way.
But that's how many goals we got against you last time. What was he spouting about? Ian not making you jump out of your seat?
And Rush is on the break as well. That's played into the path of Ian Rush. And he never fails with that sort of chance. The arms go up.
Brilliant. Hey, when he scored goals like this, the Anfield fans wanted to jump over the live buildings. I'll concede that Greavesy was a bit special in the box, but so was Dracula. And he didn't like crosses either. But Rushy hasn't beaten when it comes to real clinical finishing. Ron Atkinson, known affectionately to his friends as Cougar Ron, said when he was sacked by Manchester United last year that Rushy is the greatest goal scorer of all time. He worked it out that if it hadn't been for all the goals that Rushy kept banging in for Liverpool, United might have won a few more things and kept him in work, and gold bracelets and toothpicks and holidays in the sun. How often did Jimmy Greaves have to play against teams with 8 or 9 men back in defence? It's a funny old game. That's the sort of barrier that Rushy has come up against week in and week out. But he has still managed to maintain a phenomenal scoring rate. As an all-round goal scorer, long-range shots from either foot, headers and vital tap-ins, Ian Rush is no equal. He is the greatest. Now, in case you think I'm just a joker, I'm going to call 2 witnesses. No, not Des O'Connor or Oliver Reed. But 2 men who really know what they're talking about when they say that Ian Rush is the greatest. First is somebody who played in the same FA Cup winning team as Greavesy, but is now ready to explain why he would select Ian Rush ahead of him. Former Spurs centre-half and now Wales team manager, Mike England. Mike, tell me, what makes a former teammate of Jimmy Greaves come here along to support Ian Rush?
Well, as you know, I played with Jimmy Greaves for 8 years, and it was a great pleasure because he was a super player. But there comes along, in a lifetime, a genius. And in Ian Rush, that's what we have. We have a player that is just quite incredible because his goal-scoring feats to date are comparable to Jimmy Greaves's. He's only 24, and I'm quite convinced that by the time he is 31 or 32, he will have surpassed Jimmy Greaves. He works so hard and creates chances for the rest of his team. And he's also very unselfish by creating chances for them to score. And this is another plus that he has, I think, over Jimmy Greaves. It's his work rate.
Right, and you've got 2 players on the line. You've got Ian Rush, you've got Jimmy Greaves. Right, don't forget your life depends on it. Who would you bring on?
Well, if my head was on the chopping block, there'd be no question or no doubt in my mind that Ian Rush would be my man because, as I say, he's such an all-round player, and he is, at the moment, a genius in football. And I think in years' time, you'll look back and you will say that Ian Rush was something very, very special.
Thank you, Mike. I'm sure you agree that Mike has just sewn up the case for me. But just in case there are any doubters here, to add his voice of authority is one of the few people who knows what it's like to be shot out by both Jimmy Greaves and Ian Rush. Former England goalkeeper, a magnificent last line of defence for Liverpool, conductor of the Cup Choir, and now Spurs man of 1,000 games, Ray Clemence. How do they compare?
Well, as you say, I played against Jimmy in his last year when he was at West Ham. He actually scored against me at Upton Park. But Jimmy was not a worker. He was just a goal scorer, a magnificent attribute to have. But watching him at the end of his career, he would stand around and be inactive for long, long periods in a game, and then all of a sudden the ball would come to him in a situation around the penalty area and he would create a chance for himself. Whereas Ian Rush, over the years that I played with him and have now played against him, he is a problem for any defence for 90 minutes of a game.
Oh, and he's got past them both. The clip in towards Rush with a header. 1-0. Rush has done it again.
Now Rush turning away from Clark. Rush again. Can Rush score? And Ian Rush shows just how it's done.
So as a man who played against both players, you'd rate Ian Rush the greatest?
Yes, Jimmy Greaves is a great goal scorer, but I feel the game has become so much faster, so much more competitive, better organised defences, and Rushy for me has got to be the greatest for me.
Well, that's it then. My case is proved. Ian Rush the greatest. Why else would Juventus have invested a record £3.2 million on him? Rush is not just the greatest goal scorer in Britain, but the world. Yes, I rate him even higher than Maradona. He may not have the ball skills of Diego, but when the chips are down, the player all managers would want in their team is this man, Ian Rush. He is without question the deadliest finisher in modern British football, and Liverpool built 4 championship teams on the foundation of his goals. Jimmy Greaves was never in one league title winning side. Sorry Jim, it's a funny old game. Rushy is also a terrifically competitive player. His goals just don't decorate matches, they win them. That's why he must be named the greatest.
Thank you, Stan. Well, you and your expert witnesses, Mike England and Ray Clemence, have given our sports jury so much to consider now as they move towards their big moment. But first, I'm now going to ask Ted to take the chance to make a short final address to the jury as to why he still considers Jimmy Greaves to have been the greatest. Ted.
Nice try, Stan. I reckon you could have got Crippen off. The members of the jury, on the evidence you've heard here this evening, you must be honest and admit that my client is guilty. Jimmy Greaves, of course, is guilty of murder. He always murdered opposing teams. He's also, I have to admit that because of the number of famous defenders' reputation he destroyed, he's also guilty of manslaughter. Furthermore, I can see that in the opposing penalty area, he was guilty of loitering with intent, daylight robbery and hit and run, and for carrying an offensive weapon on his person, his left foot. As far as my learned friend Stan Boardman is concerned, we're all aware, none more than Des O'Connor, that he might be an expert on GM and aircraft, but not, I'm afraid, on footballers. Just let me remind you that Jimmy Greaves could score against any defence, then and now, because with the best will in the world, you cannot contain genius. And yes, I must admit, football's a funny old game, Stan. It is. And when Greavesy was playing, believe me, it was a great old game. Members of the jury, I rest my case.
Now, Stan Boardman, can you please make your brief closing remarks in support of Ian Rush?
Well, I'm sorry, Ted, but I think that this evening you've won Dusty Bin. Sure, Jimmy Greaves scored more goals than Ian Rush, but against teams that used to play with 5 attacking forwards. And don't forget, we have provided enough evidence to show that Rushy puts in 90 minutes playing time, while Greavesy was content to flit in and out of games. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, You look a sober lot to me. Prove it by voting Ian Rush the greatest, and prove to my old friend Ted Rogers that it's a funny old game.
Thank you, gentlemen, both. And there you have it. But before asking our sports jury to deliver their verdict, I should, of course, point out, as I usually do, that each jury member agreed to come here with an open mind. We barred any Tottenham or Liverpool supporters for obvious reasons. Now, please cast your votes now. The verdict of our sports jury by 7 votes to 5 is that Ian Rush is the greatest. Well, that will surprise a lot of people up and down the country. It'll delight them on Merseyside. Thanks, of course, to Ted Rogers and to Stan Boardman. Some good football arguments there, mixed with all the fun. I think you'll agree. So tonight, Ian Rush is the greatest. I'll leave the rest of the argument to you. You be the judge. Good night.
On Channel 4 shortly, Odyssey.